So today we have something really cool. I recorded a video recently talking about decentralized finance. Essentially, it's using blockchain technology to reimagine and redesign how finance looks to make it more fair for the average person. I asked for feedback from you and the response was very positive. So today I'll be talking more about decentralized finance again, and we'll hear from some experts in the field who can teach us more about it. So I want to begin by saying that I believe blockchain technology will change the world in many different ways. I'm not alone in thinking this either. Cathie Wood, for example, the famous Tesla investor, includes blockchain in her 5 platforms of disruption. But that doesn't mean blockchain will solve all of the world's problems, as some people claim that it will. It doesn't mean that investing in blockchain and cryptocurrency isn't risky. In fact, because the technology is so new, it's one of the most risky investment sectors around, if not the most. So let's be very clear about that early on. The cryptocurrency bubble of 2017 was painful for some of you and for myself personally. That bubble was sparked in part by ICOs, with some projects just coming up with ideas and raising tens of millions of dollars. Funnily enough, many of those ideas might actually be successful, but in 10 years from now, not today and not back in 2017. In the dot-com bubble, there was a famous company that failed called Pets.com. They had this crazy idea of selling pet food online, and obviously that actually makes a lot of sense today, but they failed in part because they were simply too early. In technology, there's this great saying: we overestimate the impact of technology in the short term and underestimate the effect in the long run. I think it's fair to say that in the late 90s, people overestimated the short-term impact of the internet, but they also underestimated the long-term effect. I doubt many people thought the internet would influence just about every industry and facet of our lives in the world that it does today. When it comes to blockchain, I think it will be similar. Most people, and I'll admit I'm included in this, we overestimated the short-term impact of blockchain a few years ago. Now, the reason I'm interested in decentralized finance especially is because it's the first sector in blockchain which appears to be actually gaining adoption with users. Here's a chart showing you the total value locked up in decentralized finance. Now, it would take a long time to explain all of the dynamics of what this chart is, so let me just say that it can be used somewhat as a proxy of adoption of DeFi. And as we can see, it has been increasing over time. Now, my responsibility to you is to be neutral and to present you with both sides of the argument so you can form your own opinions. So let's present some of the negatives. Well, you could argue that the adoption in decentralized finance, or DeFi, is coming from people who are already in the blockchain sector. Blockchains like Ethereum are currently too slow to scale for real-world adoption. Finance as a sector is heavily regulated. The user experience in blockchain at the moment is simply terrible. And there is a risk of smart contract hacks. So if you choose to research blockchain or decentralized finance, I want you to be aware that there are significant challenges. Challenges which won't be overcome in the next 12 months, probably not even the next few years. Remember, people tend to overestimate the short-term impact when it comes to technology. But the reason I personally enjoy researching decentralized finance is because I think, and this is just my personal opinion, but I think these problems are all solvable in the long term. And if they can be solved, then using blockchain to underpin finance could fundamentally, at its core, be a better system. Now, it isn't today, but it could be in the future. You could compare it to Netflix and Blockbuster. Say in 1995, internet speeds were too slow, streaming video would quickly max out the download capacity per month, smart TVs and smartphones didn't even exist. In fact, in 1995, a video streaming service literally made no sense. Blockbuster's business model at the time was better. In 2007, Netflix launched their video streaming service. By 2010, Blockbuster was out of business. So in 1995, video streaming was a worse business model than renting physical DVDs. But at some point between 1995 and 2010, the internet improved so much that at some point between these two dates, this completely flipped. But I think it's similar with blockchain. I think that many use cases are worse today on a blockchain than the traditional methods. They're not better, they're actually much worse. But I believe there will come a day when this switches and the old business models will either have to adapt or they'll die. So I want to be really clear about this. I do think that decentralized finance faces many issues and adoption will not happen overnight. In fact, if we look at the traditional adoption curve chart, I think we're currently in the very beginning. There's a decent chance that the industry could continue growing over the next few years into the next next phase. There's also a strong chance, in my opinion, that decentralized finance might struggle for several years after this to cross the chasm between the visionaries and the pragmatists. I'm also kind of hesitant to discuss decentralized finance with you because I know how technology usually plays out. If you look back to the railway bubble, the dot-com bubble, or just about any bubble through history, what tends to happen is that prices front-run adoption. And once this happens to such a ridiculous level, a bubble ends up forming. So there could be a situation where we are, let's say, around here on the adoption chart, but investments are being priced as if we're around here. When people realize adoption occurs over the course of decades, not months, prices could then crash. So I want to be clear about that too. I think decentralized finance really could change the face of finance over the next couple of decades. And I think some of the developments going on right now are so worth researching because it is truly fascinating to follow. But at the same time, be careful and try to learn from the mistakes of people like myself who invested in the cryptocurrency bubble in 2017. Now that I've hopefully done my job by outlining the potential of decentralized finance, but also really highlighting the risks, let's introduce our two experts in the field. We have Ali and Arnie of Plutus DeFi. They're going to break down the benefits of decentralized finance for us, and interestingly, their project is building on top of DeFi to improve the user experience. So when it comes to simplifying things for users and improving our experience while using it, these guys really are at the forefront. I'd like to thank them for sponsoring this video, and let's get straight into it. Ali, Arnie, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having us around.
Thanks for inviting us. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to be talking to you both. Now, in the intro to this video, I discussed how decentralized finance really faces a lot of challenges. Whether it's the underlying blockchains being slow, the user experience not being as good as traditional finance, or regulatory hurdles. And I want to hear your take on decentralized finance and how it can overcome these challenges that it faces. But first, I want to imagine for a second that we've solved all of these issues. Let's pretend we're 5 to 10 years in the future. Tell me why finance based on blockchain at its very core could be better than the current systems we have, whether that's cost savings, greater access for the unbanked, or whatever you would say. Tell me, why would the average person who's watching this video, who might have no interest in technology or blockchain, why should they be interested?
Sure. I can start with my view of your question. So let's just kind of, before we talk about decentralized finance, let's talk about what blockchain does, right? Blockchain, is the truth machine. It sort of allows people to exchange trust without the middleman, right? Finance is just a use case on top of that. So imagine a world where today you're having to take permission from your bank sometimes on wanting to withdraw cash from ATMs when you hold the balance, but they put limits on it. Or imagine having to go to banks for permission. So basically what I'm getting at is a lot of these middlemen who facilitate transaction sort of have been entrenched in the system, right? With decentralized finance, what you're sort of looking at is you're looking at providing all of these financial tools, and also sort of disseminating trust in a sort of a peer-to-peer decentralized manner that is kind of cryptographically secured. So what that really means is all of the abuse of power with the banking scandals that have happened, with the concentration of information with select parties, because knowledge is power, because information is concentrated. All of that disseminates to the community in that way. Hence, you can start seeing more fairness, more openness towards people who are unbanked. For instance, it's a cliche in DeFi about including the unbanked, but it's so important as well, them being part of the system, right? So I think in a world 5 years down the line, 6 years down the line, when this becomes more mainstream, this is what we're really looking at, where people are able to sort of take advantage of a lot of the financial system, feel more inclusive towards it, don't feel discriminated, and they sort of also leverage the fact that they can get better returns on the product. Of course, this is all caveated with the fact that people have to be more aware about their own financial future, how to plan it, because there is risk in smart contracts becoming the trust mechanism in that. So but I think we are hoping that in 5 years time the frameworks improve so much that there is a great deal of security around that, and there's a lot better education in terms of how people perceive, using finance, decentralized finance as such.
So I think that the first point you mentioned about banking the unbanked is a huge one.
Yeah.
There's billions of people worldwide that just don't have bank accounts and can't really get access to that. And decentralized finance and using blockchain really bridges that chasm. But I'm wondering maybe more on the people who are already banked. What specific things would you shout out to them that they are going to benefit in the long term from this?
The longer term really is about, there is this one thing about talking about, like, you can sort of, have increased savings compared to the, the 0.5%, 1%, 1.5% you get. You can sort of make sure you can, sort of stretch your financial future, financial security even more. Secondly, you control your funds, which means that, you're not giving it to someone and relying on them to decide when and how you access your funds. So I think all of these things will start playing a bigger picture into, how things are done. I mean, we are already looking at a use case in about, how do we bring mobile money in West Africa, onto some of the solutions we're looking at. To give you an example, West African countries, a lot of people use, mobile money on, which means if they get paid, it is on mobile credits, or if they pay bills, it's all using mobile credits. Now imagine, with these people, the currency is massively inflated. Now with DeFi, right, it does not have to be 5 years. I'm talking about literally a year or even 6 months later, if we manage to pull this off and implement the solution. Imagine them moving into DeFi. First of all, they hedge the risk of inflation. Secondly, they get better savings, right? So that's a practical example you don't have to wait for 5 years for.
That's a huge use case, and really kind of leads nicely into the next question. I was going to make the point that this is, people, I guess, like 2 or 3 years ago said blockchain's a great idea and cryptocurrency is cool, but there's no real world adoption. And we're kind of seeing, I would say, one of the first sectors actually seeing real adoption. We're seeing people genuinely using DeFi. We're seeing more and more funds getting locked up every single day. But at the same time, you could argue it's kind of, in some way, like an echo chamber. Most of the people who are using DeFi are already within cryptocurrency. And you really see that huge disruption when you can bridge the gap to the outside world. And you kind of touched on it there with West Africa and a real use case. What do you think decentralized finance needs to do differently? Needs to build upon to achieve that real world adoption with people outside of cryptocurrency?
Arnie and I both have discussed, what does a typical customer within finance look like, right? Who uses finance? Everyone does, right? We went and sort of mapped, this inverted. Think of this as, customer segmentation, but done as an inverted triangle, right? Where the lowest part of the triangle is basically all the DeFi users who are very much entrenched, knowing the risks. Well, in not all the cases, but in most of the cases, they understand, the complexity that comes with DeFi. And that's a very small group, because that's literally the last part of the triangle. If you take the next part of the triangle, it's a little bigger. These are people who are familiar with crypto, but not familiar with DeFi. And then you're looking at the bigger part of the triangle, which are people who are very familiar with world finance and have heard about crypto, or basically have got introduced to the concept of crypto. And then the last part of the triangle, right, which is the inverted base, is everyone else, which is people who are unbanked, or people actually, I would say, who have access, who are part of very developed economies, but are ignorant about how to best plan the financial future. Right. So if you start breaking down the customer segmentation in that manner, you can slowly start figuring out how to provide solutions, and what level of engagement they need within DeFi to sort of, get themselves introduced to this new world finance. So in the case of, for instance, the unbanked, the last part of the customer segmentation, they have a great opportunity to leapfrog right from, being where they are into DeFi. Right. So that's where we will start seeing a lot of movement, and kind of we are excited in providing some of the tools, that's on our roadmap to see how we bridge that gap, really.
That's so interesting. Like you say, the ability to sort of leapfrog. Yeah. And you often have that with technology. Like we in the UK, for example, we had landlines and then we went to mobile phones. But many other countries just skipped landlines because they came along at a time where you could have a mobile phone, and why would you build out the landline system? I kind of think of it, maybe you guys do as well, similar with decentralized finance.
I think that's one of the reasons why, for DeFi projects, it's about how to, like you said in the last question, how to tap into a new periphery of people whereby they don't have access to traditional finance. So if you look at, using that sort of landline analogy, the whole point about DeFi is to re-empower people who come from disadvantaged economic, social backgrounds, whether based on nationality, geographic region, you name it, right? And to give them access to essentially, financial tools and, through technology to, equalize the playing field. So it means that people who maybe, for example, if you're looking at the way mobile money credits developed, not just in Africa, but, outside, Western countries, is essentially acting as like a proxy bank account where you don't have maybe necessarily the right documentation. Maybe you can't afford to renew your passport. Maybe you don't have the right kind of ability or language to read and write, fill in applications. It's kind of common outside the West, and people take that for granted. And so enabling people to access financial tools to pay their bills, to pay their rent, to earn income, to bill people, to invoice, that kind of leads the path. That's the sort of epistemology of what DeFi is about, putting, financial power back into people's hands. And so if you look at what we're building with DeFi, and not just us, but other projects in the ecosystem, it's about how do we build tools which can be used without there having to be bureaucratic barriers, whether it's imposed by, government, regional bodies, authorities, you name it, right? And allowing people to transact freely internationally across borders without being impinged, without being, charged a fee, without all kinds of, necessary requirements that we currently have in the current world. And I think you really just take it back to the reason why Bitcoin was, invented by Satoshi, was exactly, during the height of the financial crisis in 2008, to, have a different economic system whereby people's wealth was not being eroded by inflation, by, the mass printing of fiat currencies by banks and governments around the world to prop up an economic system basically underpinned by debt. Because at the end of the day, those who are going to be impacted the most are the ones at the bottom of that economic ladder. So we're building tools to try and enable people to, interact financially, socially, whatever it may be, but in a way that's decentralized. So there are no requirements on any other parties or third parties. They can just simply access on with, whether it be a laptop, a web browser, or a mobile, and start to use these financial tools in a free way. And I think that's where the ethos comes from decentralized finance, is people have sort of had enough of either putting their money in traditional bank accounts where the banks are generating 15 to 20% off of our money, but we're being given 0.5% or 1%. It's about basically taking back financial power away from, middlemen and brokers and you name it, and actually having a system that's actually fair. That same analogy can also be represented in the way in which people are fighting back against tech companies for their privacy. Why should our data be sold to marketing companies or multinational companies to learn our spending habits, our communication habits, all the like of that, without us benefiting from the sort of the financial motive? Why is that privatized? Why is essentially our personal, social, interpersonal data being privatized by these companies, and we're not seeing the benefit? So, there are lots of niche sort of battlegrounds happening throughout the world, and DeFi is one of those, just on a financial spectrum.
Such good points. And I kind of want to go into actually an example that you mentioned there. So I think it's the best example you can actually give, and it comes with the banks. The idea, I kind of want to pass over to you actually. Describe sort of for the audience how banks work and how decentralized finance could take out the middleman while giving the people on the end of the two transactions, so that the lender and the borrower, significantly more money without the bank just taking a ridiculous cut for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I can explain it in a very simple way. And Ali knows the sort of traditional infrastructure around it because he's worked in the corporate environment for a long time. But to a simple person like me, essentially what it means is if I want to take a loan out, I can, collateralize my loan with some kind of digital asset that I have that I'm not using, and take that loan out to pay a bill, or I might pay a loan off with higher interest and take the loan out with using something that's low interest. So I'm actually saving on the cost of a loan. Another way in which it could be is, I might, change currencies, but through a decentralized financial software or tech, without paying, 5 to 10% huge broker fees. If you use example of like Western Union, if you're sort of a migrant worker here, you're paying large fees to remit your currencies back to families abroad. Decentralized finance cuts all of that out, and I think that's why initially, Libra and Facebook had big resistance from governments, because they are entrenched players in a financial system where they're essentially squeezing out every single basis point they can from people like us. And when you're basically representing or putting forward a strategy that basically rips away billions of dollars from monopolies, they're not happy about that. But Facebook and Libra is sort of a separate topic. But within that is the kernel of the idea of what is happening. It's the transformation of the way in which value and labor, which is generated by people, is actually transferred from one to another. So, just to, I guess, to answer your question, it means that, using, for example, a money market protocol, which is essentially a smart contract, I will insert one currency or deposit a digital asset, and I will either get interest back or I will receive some kind of exchange, but I know exactly what I'm getting determined by what that money market protocol is. So it's, imagine accessing a loan, but instead of going to a bank or a broker and sitting down and agreeing a fixed interest rate or variable rate, I can actually do it myself and not pay the huge fee in the middle.
Tell me then, what's your role within this ecosystem?
So with the Plutus DeFi, we initially started out as a sort of DeFi lending aggregator. So me and Ali have been in this space for a long time, and the DeFi tech was quite primitive over the last 2 years. And what we wanted to do was really make it easier to use. There were some platforms where you were dealing with your own, money essentially, and the boxes weren't even labeled. Some of the inputs were, unidentifiable, and it was a massive risk for someone who isn't from the crypto space to come in and try and use those assets. You don't even know what you're doing. I wouldn't even know, where those funds were going if I was paid, for example, using an example, if I was putting 10,000 into the gas price or putting 10,000 to be sent to someone else, like that's simply how it was. It was very crude. Essentially prototypes being pushed out. And we wanted to use our experience of understanding aesthetics of products, user flow, user experience, and essentially also being investors in this space, to build and refine a platform where people could access these money market protocols in a much more easier and pleasant way, where you reduce the anxiety, where you reduce the friction, and all the other issues. And then from there, we realized actually it doesn't make sense for individual DeFi projects to be siloed, and that actually is against the sort of philosophy behind DeFi. So that's how we started building out a DeFi full stack aggregator, where you might deposit your asset into a money market protocol, but then you can click one button and buy insurance from Nexus Mutual or OPYN, or you could run it through a mixer. So it's actually about talking about how do we build an interoperable DeFi full stack platform where all the functionality in DeFi is in one place. And so far, there isn't anyone else out there building that apart from us. And for us, it's just a natural conclusion that we should be pulling all of these things into one place. And because these companies are essentially rivals, they won't do that. But we're agnostic and we can do that.
I mean, it's also solution driven, right? Like we are very, very solution driven. When I spoke to you about that customer segmentation, that's so important for us because we are looking at solutions. We're looking at unique angles and use cases where DeFi could be, made a practical use case depending on who that audience is, right? Be it for that unbanked or be it for someone who's just aware of cryptocurrency but not entrenched in the system. So, we are looking at everything that's in DeFi, whatever we can aggregate, right? And then bring those solutions, surface those solutions out to people, right? And just to touch on a previous point, which was around, trying to explain what DeFi generally is in comparison to banks. The way I kind of, the way it is, and to simply explain this is, think of Ethereum, right? Like the world where all of the money and all the liquidity is sat in that world of Ethereum, right? And then look at Compound and DYDX as banks, right? And them sort of, determining, how the financial system works through that. So you can choose to either go to Compound or DYDX and, lend with them. So that analogy, right, sort of gives a perspective of that Ethereum is the world where all the liquidity is. There are lenders and there are borrowers, and basically it's a pool, right? Nobody controls anyone, right? Which is the beauty of it, and interest rates are decided based on every single block that comes through, right? So this is just an interesting way to kind of look through and understand how this can be different from the traditional, sort of banking and financial systems in terms of lending and borrowing, for instance.
It's a great point, and I love what you guys are really doing. You're building that user experience on top. Like you say, if you've got lots of different solutions, it's really quite difficult for the average person to try and pick between which solution they want to use. They don't know which are more secure. They don't know if there's they don't know the kind of rates between. And sure, you can go to a website and you can maybe check the different interest rates, the borrowing rates, the lending rates. But why would you want to do that? Why would you not just want to use one solution which aggregates everything together? It's these kind of building blocks which are really, I think we're obviously very, very early in decentralized finance, incredibly early at the moment. But it's these kind of building blocks which you can understand in the long term. They take something which is very difficult to use and is building simplicity into it, and it could actually end up drawing more people in as a result.
Absolutely. I think, the simple way to put this would be like when we did our lending solution last year, it was like, hey, let's just build our moneysupermarket.com, right? Where you could just come into one place and start like, building, having multiple wallets, multiple protocols, multiple currencies, all in one place, so that you don't have to think, you don't have to go to different platforms, you don't have to get used to different user interfaces, right? And then, we can just kind of keep building on it. And then from there, the idea just took off. Like, let's just do this based on customer segmentation, what solutions might be useful, because this practically solves that last mile problem, right? Where someone has not just written a smart contract and a protocol and it's up to developers to build something and use it. No, we will bring that solution to people's homes, through the use cases that we're thinking through. Yeah.
So I'm interested to really understand your long-term vision. In your documents, you describe that part of your solution is to aggregate multiple decentralized finance solutions for individuals and institutions. And as we've been describing, sort of like that aggregating process to make it more easy for people to use and for institutions to use in the future as well. I'm really interested to understand where you see decentralized finance being in 10 years and what you think your role is going to be.
For the institutions, I'd like to address that particular point. So the way we want to sort of, do this is we also extending a lot of the tech that we're building in the form of SDK. We call that DeFi as a service, right? So the SDK then could be used by, funds, financial institutions, exchanges, OTCs, whoever wants to provide those services, and they can just hook that up into their system, create their own little front end for it, and, just service the customers. But behind the scenes, it's all powered by Plutus DeFi, right? So that's how we want to sort of get into the game for institutions, really. But the idea generally in 10 years time, if I had a crystal ball, it would be easy to predict. But I just think that we are also incredibly early in it, and we're still experimenting in the phase in terms of what this finance looks like. Financial derivatives in the normal world, in our world currently, are complicated enough. We've seen the crash in 2008, because of the subprime crisis, right? And that sort of came about because of extremely complex financial instruments. I have a background in doing swaps and options, and within commodity trading as well. I used to sort of work within sort of designing systems and designing process and operations around these things, and I know how complicated it can get. Adding DeFi on top of it, puts it on steroids, right? Imagine some kid who hasn't worked in the real world, but is very proficient with writing smart contracts, sitting and writing this smart contract, which is this kick-ass derivative, but without realizing the risk, but he's able to market it really well, and people start using that. That's incredibly risky. So I think it has to be taken with an understanding that, there needs to be sufficient audits. There needs to be enough governance in place, for this to be successful, right? It cannot be like a wild west saying, hey, this new tech has come, let's just use it for 1 or 2 years, let's see what happens, and then we move on. It cannot be the ICO hype that happened in 2017, because as an industry, we will fail if this DeFi remains a hype.
If people want to learn more about Plutus DeFi, where would you recommend that they go? Is there a particular location? Would you say your website, your Telegram? Where would you recommend?
Website, Telegram, Twitter, Medium. I mean, all the full links are on our website, PlutusDeFi.com. So users can sort of, go in there, right at the bottom, those links are there. They can follow our Medium articles. And of course, we have a Telegram group as well, and it's been growing quite rapidly. So, will be a pleasure having them on the group and support us as a community. And also, like, the product is live, so people are free to use. They go to PlutusDeFi.com, start lending, and they can play around with it, right? The smart contract are under audits right now, but we've definitely gone through a full round of beta, so it's been quite an experience. But yeah, PlutusDeFi.com is the place
All
to
right,
be.
I'd love to have you guys back on again in the future. For now, guys, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Take care.